Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of American Genesis, the creation of American Scripture, where we're looking at the creation of our country during that period of time between 1776 and 1787, where the major documents that govern our country, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, were created. We're looking at the historical events surrounding them and as well as the documents. So, let's get started with a little music.
If tomorrow all the things were lost I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died and gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Okay, well, let's do a little review of what we talked about last week. Last week, we actually looked at the content of the Declaration of Independence. We reviewed this in terms of what was going on with the Second Continental Congress, and then we reviewed the life of the principal author, Thomas Jefferson. We looked at the introduction to the Declaration of Independence. This is where Jefferson asserted the right of natural law to justify the movement towards independence. And then we looked at the preamble, which is really the genius of the document. Remember, I told you that he did in about 200 words what it took John Locke about 2,000 pages to actually say the philosophical reasoning behind the coming revolution. And then we reviewed those charges of crimes that he leveled against King George III, Parliament, and the British people. Remember, this is treason. Thomas Jefferson and signers of the Declaration of Independence were committing treason in the eyes of the British government. We then saw how the document ended with Jefferson asking the signers to pledge their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor by signing the document. And finally, we reviewed some of the legendary anecdotes that surrounded the Declaration of Independence, some of those stories that have become, we don't really know if they happen or not, but they're so great you have to talk about them. So let's have a trivia question. July the 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, saw two of the founding fathers of the American Genesis die within 2 hours of each other. Who were they? Okay, you may know this, but the deaths of former Presidents Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the second and third presidents of the United States, occurred exactly on the day of the 50th anniversary. It was both extraordinary and just a little bit eerie. The two had been bitter enemies in their prime, but they had reconciled their differences and they had become friends again, and they were having a long-standing writing relationship. Jefferson was 83 when he died in his home in Monticello, Virginia, about noon. Adams, who was 90, died about 2 hours later at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts. His reported last words were, "At least Jefferson still lives." Well, he didn't. He did not know that. And here's another eerie coincidence. Exactly 5 years to the date, on the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the fifth president, James Monroe, died. Kind of an eerie thing that went on there. Well, what happened to these signers? We talked last week of these 56 men that signed the Declaration of Independence and how they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. I could tell you about this, but I'll be honest. I know a man that can tell you a lot better, and I know you will recognize this if you've been a long-time listener of radio. A man by the name of Paul Harvey. And this is one of his most famous recitations.
Americans, the how and the why of our beloved republic are so much better known and understood than the who. The United States of America was born in 1776, but it was conceived 169 years before that. The earliest settlers had watered the New World with much sweat. They had built substantial holdings for themselves, for their families. And when the time came to separate themselves from a tyranny an ocean away, at best it meant starting all over again after the ravages of war. Researching what you're about to hear gave a whole new dimension to my reverence for our nation's first citizens. All others of the world's revolutions, before and since, were initiated by men who had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. Our founders had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except one thing. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You remember the cherry tree fiction. A long time after you have forgotten the more earth-shaking history-making episodes in the life of George Washington. You have misplaced in your memory the details of Ben Franklin's statesmanship, but you remember his flying a kite. Joyce Kilmer was a great military hero, but the only thing you personally recall about him is his poetic tribute to trees. Maybe of this current decade, that which will be remembered best will not be its wars and its moon rockets or its crumbling frontiers or the giants who lived and died. Maybe all that'll survive to linger in the day-by-day vocabulary of generations yet unborn may be the songs of a Memphis minstrel or the reincarnation of electric automobiles. But for any eve of the 4th of July, I, Paul Harvey, do herewith bequeath unto you something to remember. You may not be able to quote one line from the Declaration of Independence at this moment. Henceforth, you'll always be able to quote at least one line. It's in the last paragraph where you will recall when I remind you. It says, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." In the Pennsylvania State House that's now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the best men from each of the colonies sat down together. This was a very fortunate hour in our nation's history, one of those rare occasions in the lives of men when we had greatness to spare. These were men of means, well-educated. 24 were lawyers and jurists. 9 were farmers, owners of large plantations. On June 11, a committee sat down to draw up a Declaration of Independence. We were going to tell the British fatherland no more rule by redcoats. Below the dam of ruthless foreign rule, the stream of freedom was running shallow and muddy, and we were going to light a fuse to dynamite that dam. This pact, as Burke later put it, was a partnership between the living and the dead and the yet unborn. There was no bigotry, there was no demagoguery in this group. All had shared hardships. Jefferson finished a draft of the document in 17 days. Congress adopted it in July, and so much is familiar history. But now, King George III had denounced all rebels in America as traitors. Punishment for treason was hanging. The names now so familiar to you from the several signatures on that Declaration of Independence, the names were kept secret for 6 months, for each knew the full meaning of that magnificent last paragraph in which his signature pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. 56 men placed their names beneath that pledge. 56 men knew when they signed that they were risking everything. They knew if they won this fight, the best they could expect would be years of hardship in a struggling nation. And if they lost, they'd face a hangman's rope but they signed the pledge. And here is the documented fate of that gallant 56. Carter Braxton of Virginia, wealthy planter, trader, saw his ships swept from the seas. To pay his debts, he lost his home and all of his properties and died in rags. Thomas Lynch Jr., who signed that pledge, was a third-generation rice grower, aristocrat, large plantation owner. After he signed, his health failed. His wife and he set out for France to regain his failing health. Their ship never got to France, was never heard from again. Thomas McKean of Delaware was so harassed by the enemy that he was forced to move his family 5 times in 5 months. He served in Congress without pay, his family in poverty and in hiding. Vandals looted the properties of Ellery and Clymer and Hall and Gwinnett and Walton and Hayward and Rutledge and Middleton. Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia raised $2 million on his own signature to provision our allies, the French fleet. After the war, he personally paid back the loans, wiped out his entire estate, and he was never reimbursed by his government. In the final battle for Yorktown, he, Nelson, urged General Washington to fire on his, Nelson's, own home, which was occupied by Cornwallis. It was destroyed. Thomas Nelson Jr. had pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. The Hessians seized the home of Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey. Francis Lewis had his home and everything destroyed, his wife imprisoned. She died within a few months. Richard Stockton, who signed that declaration, was captured, mistreated, his health broken to the extent that he died at 51. His estate was pillaged. Thomas Hayward Jr. was captured when Charleston fell. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside while she was dying. Their 13 children fled in all directions for their lives. His fields and grist mill were laid waste. For more than a year, he lived in forests and caves and returned home after the war to find his wife dead, his children gone, his properties gone, and he died a few weeks later of exhaustion and a broken heart. Lewis Morris saw his land destroyed, his family scattered. Philip Livingston died within a few months from the hardships of the war. John Hancock, history remembers best due to a quirk of fate rather than anything he stood for. That great sweeping signature attesting to his vanity towers over the others. One of the wealthiest men in New England. And yet he stood outside Boston one terrible night of the war. And he said, "Burn Boston, though it makes John Hancock a beggar, if the public good requires it." So he too lived up to the pledge. Of the 56, few were long to survive. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes from Rhode Island to Charleston sacked, looted, occupied by the enemy, or burned. 2 lost their sons in the army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from its hardships or from its more merciful bullets. I don't know what impression you had of the men who met that summer in Philadelphia. But I think it's important that we remember this about them. They were not poor men. They were not wild-eyed pirates. These were men of means. They were rich men, most of them, and had enjoyed much ease and luxury in their personal living. Not hungry men, certainly not terrorists, not irresponsible malcontents, not fanatical incendiaries. These men were prosperous men, wealthy landowners. They were substantially secure in their prosperity. They had everything to lose. But they considered liberty, and this is as much as I shall say of it. They had learned that liberty is so much more important than security, that they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they fulfilled their pledge. They paid the price, and freedom was born.
Okay, well, boy, has there ever been anyone that had voice like Paul Harvey. I can still remember in my youth and my young adulthood listening to him as often as I could. What a great voice. Well, remarkably, the Declaration of Independence really didn't receive a whole lot of attention in the beginning. Uh, the act of declaring independence was really a big deal. They had early celebrations, but the actual document seemed to be kind of ignored. It wasn't until the emergence of political parties in 1790 that you begin to see a real interest in the actual document. That was in due part to Thomas Jefferson, who was, in today's terminology, branding himself. He was creating the Democratic Republican Party, which was in opposition to the Federalist Party of John Adams and Hamilton. But after the War of 1812, you begin to see a greater interest in that document. Some of it occurred because Congress decided to pay more attention to it. And they actually commissioned John Trumbull to paint the event, which is now installed in the Capitol. And at that point, many of the signers who were still living and others began to write biographies of each one of the signers. This kind of led to what was one historian called a cult of the signers. Now, that doesn't mean they were bad people. We've just seen that. They were great people. Folks, they gave everything for their country at this point. Of course, really, the Declaration of Independence, one of the reasons it wasn't given a whole lot of attention in the beginning was because we immediately signed on to fighting a war now. I mean, war had been declared. It had been going on now for some months, but it is now definitely declared. We have declared our independence, and we are going to fight the British Empire, the largest, most powerful army and navy in the world. And we were nothing but a bunch of ragtag farmers. What an event, So that's painting the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, General Washington, as we've seen, had been put in charge of fighting the war. Washington had been around for a long time as a warrior. He had really gained a lot of experience in the French and Indian War, and that was to have a direct impact on the strategy that he employed fighting the American Revolutionary War. To put it simply, Washington's strategy was to avoid defeat. He became an expert at choosing his battles. He knew when to defend, he knew when to attack, he knew when to withdraw. He knew as long as he kept his army intact, his aim of ultimate victory could be achieved. Because he had seen what happens when you get into a long and protracted war. Morale extinguishes, the advantage goes on the side of those who are willing to stay the battle. You think about this, folks. I've often, I grew up as a young man during the time of the Vietnam War. Every military expert in the world would have told you and did tell you that we should have won the Vietnam War without any problem at all. We were the great military power of the world fighting, a bunch of rice farmers. I'm not being derogatory there. It's just what it was. But they outlasted us. They broke down our morale. Same thing can be said of Afghanistan to some degree. Again, we should have been able to totally defeat Afghanistan. Instead, they wore us down and they broke our morale. And folks, that's what happens in a long and protracted war. Washington knew that was his advantage. He had a policy of strategic retreat. However, this didn't always go over very well. Remember, if you were an honorable man fighting an honorable war by the rules of war, then you were supposed to stand up and face each other in open combat. Horatio Gates, the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, which was actually the turning point of the Revolutionary War, actually tried to lead a plot to remove George Washington. There was even a plot to assassinate Washington. It was hatched by a British appointed governor, William Tyrrell, but it involved the loyalist mayor of New York and also members of what was called the Life Guard, which was basically Washington's personal bodyguard. Luckily, a man by the name of John Jay, who would later on play a very important part in the American government, found out about it, and he uncovered it and led to the breakup of the plot and the public hanging of one of the guys by the name of Thomas Hickey. So don't kid yourself that everybody in this war, in this country, was for the Revolutionary War, for the side of the rebels. They were not. Even some of the soldiers were not. As a result, Washington's strategy, there were very few big battles in the Revolutionary War. It went on for about 7 years, but there really wasn't a whole lot of just gigantic battles. Most of the battles were fought using guerrilla warfare tactics and, events like that. So let's look at the major battles. But first, I'm going to show you a very short film that talks about Washington's military strategy.
Predominantly defensive in nature and largely reactionary to the British, Continental strategy during the American Revolution ultimately gained independence for the United States. This strategy ran primarily through the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington. The Virginian was appointed by the Continental Congress in the spring of 1775, following the breakout of hostilities at Lexington and Concord, to mold an American army. Washington faced a Herculean task. He had to pull all of the militias then surrounding the city of Boston and form them into a single, coherent army. Washington's first objective as a field commander was to force the British to abandon the city of Boston, which they did ultimately in March of 1776. However, the British, now under the command of Sir William Howe, would come back with a vengeance, and Washington was forced to rush south to defend New York. Through the course of the spring and summer of 1776, reacting largely to Howe's offensives, Washington was driven out of New York and across New Jersey. The cause for independence, the revolution itself, seemed to be on the brink. But Washington recognized one critical fact. As long as he could keep an army in the field, the cause of independence would remain alive. Simply put, Washington could win by merely not losing. And on Christmas night, 1776, he launched an offensive in what would become known as the 10 Crucial Days. He struck back at the British, winning twin victories at Trenton and Princeton, and forcing the British to withdraw back to New York and go into winter quarters. In the spring of 1777, Washington faced two major offensives. The first, led by Sir William Howe, was to capture Philadelphia. The second, led by Sir John Burgoyne, moving south from Canada, was to capture Albany and cut off New York and New England from the rest of the colonies. That fall, the American strategy was turned on its head. Washington lost Philadelphia, the American capital, to Howe. However, the American commander in the north, Horatio Gates, defeated Burgoyne at the battles of Saratoga, and the British were forced to surrender an army operating in North America. The victory at Saratoga prompted France, as well as other European nations, to enter the conflict on the side of a young United States. This marked a great shift in Washington's strategy. Washington understood that the war had gone from a colonial rebellion to a world war, and the British could not maintain their hold on North America while having to defend other parts of their empire. So Washington engaged in a war of exhaustion. He would wear down the British morale, the British army, their supplies, exhaust them, and eat away at the public support in Great Britain for the conflict. Recognizing their inability to destroy Washington's army, the British shifted their focus from the north to the southern colonies. The South's vast economic wealth and a purportedly strong loyalist population prompted the British shift in their strategy, and thus began what is known as the Southern Campaign. By the summer of 1780, the British had a strong hold on South Carolina and were poised to move north. Continental failures prompted the appointment of Major General Nathanael Greene to command the Southern Department. Greene employed a campaign of exhaustion, which ultimately forced the British to carry the war into Virginia, which began the long road to American victory at Yorktown. Washington's victory at Yorktown convinced the British Parliament that future operations in North America were futile. Peace negotiations between the belligerent nations accelerated, finally ending in the 1783 Treaty of Paris that gave the United States its independence.
Okay, so this was kind of a good movie to kind of show you exactly what I was talking about, how Washington would just outlast his enemies. Now, this is not going to be a bunch of presentations about military history. I'm not a military historian. I like to study the battles and the wars, but that's not what we're trying to do here. I'm just going to run through real quickly the major battles to kind of refresh your memory. December 30th, 1775, which is actually before the Declaration of Independence was signed, Colonel Benedict Arnold and General Robert Montgomery had laid siege to Quebec. Unfortunately, they were not able to achieve victory in that, but it was still a very important event. The Battle of Long Island, of course, occurred after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And this is when General Howe landed on Long Island with this 35,000 plus army. And he had actually forced General Washington to evacuate Manhattan and Brooklyn, and New York City would become kind of the hub for British rule for the remainder of the war. The next big event would occur in December of 1776 with the Battle of Trenton. This is a really important battle because it surprised the German mercenary forces, the Hessians, at Trenton, New Jersey. This is when he crossed to Delaware on Christmas Eve and actually just won an overwhelming victory against the Hessians. The first really big victory that the American forces had had. The next big battle occurred that next summer and early fall, which was the siege of Saratoga in upstate New York. Remember, after the Battle of Quebec, the English had tried to come down and was going to kind of cut New England off from the rest of the country because they felt like New England was the hotbed of this. And so they were going to cut Massachusetts and some of these other colonies up there off from the rest of the country. So the Battle of Saratoga was a huge battle and one of the biggest battles of the war, actually. And ended up being General Horatio Gates ended up defeating the British Army, and which was a huge victory on the part of the American rebels. A lot of people say that this was the turning point in the war because this is what encouraged France particularly to get into the war. It also led to the infamous act of treason by Benedict Arnold. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but basically Arnold felt betrayed by Gates and felt like he had been not given his due reward, which he had not been. And as a result of being a vain man, decided to turn treason, which he tried to hand over the West Point fort. Battles of Brandywine, Pennsylvania, September 11th, 1777. Another huge battle because remember, Philadelphia was the kind of capital, which where the Second Continental Congress was meeting. Washington and Nathanael Greene had tried to defeat General Howe, but the British was able to have a victory. They seized Philadelphia, but the American army was able to escape, and they wintered in Valley Forge. This was probably the low point of the American army at that point. It was really a tough time, and the war could have gone either way at this point. General Washington had the good sense to enlist the aid of a Prussian officer that showed up, a man by the name of Baron von Steuben. And Baron von Steuben was a very well-trained army officer from Prussia. And he came and offered his services to Washington to train the army. And they spent that winter training in Valley Forge. And it ended up being a much better army. The next big battle occurred in the spring of 1778, the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey. And this is where General Clinton of the British forces, who had been replaced by Howe, who had replaced Howe, decided to evacuate Philadelphia because he felt like his lines were too far away from the British fleet. And so he was retreating, and Washington fought the British Army at a stalemate at Monmouth's courthouse, which resulted in Clinton evacuating Field and retreating clear back to New York City. So in a sense, they regained Philadelphia as a result of this battle. And then this is when the British shifted south. They decided that they would go to the south because the South had actually been more loyalist to the British than had the New England and the Middle States. They moved south and they sieged Charleston for 6 weeks, and they did defeat the American forces at Charleston. But due to the efforts of a man by the name of Francis Marion, who became famous as the Swamp Fox. You may remember that Disney had a thing about the Swamp Fox. I remember as a kid, I loved that show when they put it on. He would harass the British troops, disrupted their lines of communication, and just really denied the British victory. Even though they had won, they didn't have a good victory. They won the battle but lost the war. And then in September of 1780, the next year, that's when Benedict Arnold tried to surrender West Point to the British. Fortunately, he was found out, and he had to flee. He actually joined the British Army and would fight against the Americans in some of the later battles. But he never really gained his fame. Ended up in England, died at a young age of 60 in 1801. And then there was the Battle of Cowpens, South Carolina. This is when General Nathaniel Greene defeated the British troops under General Cornwallis for the first time. It was a huge battle. And one of the major engagements took place between Colonel Daniel Morgan and a British colonel who had become the very personification of evil in the mind of the rebels in the South, Banastre Tarleton. And his forces were completely destroyed, forcing Cornwallis to retreat to the Virginia coast near Yorktown. If you've ever seen The Patriot with Mel Gibson's portrayal of a Revolutionary soldier, this is the events that they're talking about. His character was based on Daniel Morgan. And if you've ever seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about here. And finally, the major battle that ended the war was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, September and October. Cornwallis had been forced back to the coast at Yorktown, Virginia. And Washington's army had been completely surrounding him, and he had been reinforced by some French troops, as well as the French fleet arrived off the coast of Yorktown, basically cutting off Cornwallis's retreat. The result was Cornwallis completely surrendered his army, and all hopes of British victory collapsed with this. That led ultimately to direct negotiations in Paris, which led to the signing of the Treaty of Paris. So the war is fought over this period of years, and the Americans finally forced the British into surrender. Folks, I can't tell you how big this was just a huge event. It would be like, it would be about like the Viet Cong defeating the American army in the Vietnam War. That's exactly what it was. The British defeat at Yorktown forced the British into negotiations. That spring of 1782, they began in Paris. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams were the negotiators for the treaty, and they hammered it out over a period of months. Finally, the British signed a treaty acknowledging the United States as a free country, ceding the territory east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes. Noticeably, they did not cede Canada. Some Americans wanted Canada, and some Americans wanted to continue fighting the war to get Canada. But the Americans said, no, we've accomplished what we set out to do. They also granted fishing rights in the Grand Banks off the coast of New England. It's a huge deal. All prisoners of war were released. Restitution for loyalist lands seized by the United States. Well, I'm not for sure that any of that ever took place. Right to use of the Mississippi River for both parties. So we also gained the right to use the Mississippi River, as we would find out that didn't last very long because the French and the Spanish had other ideas. While the terms certainly seemed favorable to the United States, they were actually generous because the British, they knew, okay, we've lost this, but we also need to strike an alliance now with this new country, because the last thing they wanted was a continued alliance between the United States and France. And so, as we will see, or as perhaps you know, for the next 25, 30 years, there's kind of an ongoing battle between England and France and America for an alliance, which ultimately ended up leading to the War of 1812, where the British again tried to retake their lost colonies. Didn't work out for them, but they tried. So the hard part's over, right? Well, not really. You've all heard the old story about the dog that chased the car and finally caught it. What do you do now? We had caught the car. We had now become a separate independent country. Now the act of governing took place. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he used the term United States of America as one of the first instances where that term was used. But folks, the problem was we were anything but united. We were actually three different regions. We were New England, made up of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And they were a fishing, shipping country. And then we were a group of middle states, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. And they were basically had burgeoning industries, commercial industries in New York, agriculture. And then there was the southern states of Virginia, Maryland, South and North Carolina, and Georgia, which obviously had slave-based agricultural economies that grew tobacco, rice, and indigo. So we were anything but united. And these three areas did not particularly like each other, to say the least. There was a great deal of animosity between New England and the middle states, and New England and the southern states. So on top of everything else, there was a patchwork quilt of tax systems. Every state had their own tax system, and that wasn't going to work out. There was no common currency. It was one person that called it the kaleidoscope of currency. Political divisions, they did not politically agree with each other. In fact, there was serious proposals to divide the new United States into four nations: an eastern, middle, southern, and trans-Allegheny nations. There were serious talks about this, that they were so different. It even extended into foreign affairs because every state was conducting foreign affairs on its own. Georgia was involved in an unofficial war with Spain over the Indian problems, and Virginia and Pennsylvania saw the closing of New Orleans, which damaged their export trade. New England states wanted nothing to do with Britain, while New York and Pennsylvania wanted reconciliation. And the southern states preferred working with France, which the others distrusted. It was a mess, folks. I'm telling you, it was anything but a United States of America. It was to the point that Washington, Madison, James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson all expressed publicly that they fully expected this nation to divide into separate regions. They said there's no way that this is going to work. The Confederation was, one person called it a rope of sand. Another one said that the state systems are the accursed thing that will prevent our nation from taking place. So, folks, don't kid yourself. We were like the dog that caught the car. We didn't know what to do with it after we'd caught it. So, not next week, in 2 weeks, we're going to see how the United States progressed from a government ruled by what was called the Articles of Confederation to a new constitutional government. And that's where we will progress into the Constitution, the second great part of America's scripture. So that's it for the day. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. Next week, I will not be here. It's Labor Day. I'm going to take the day off and give you guys a day to go work. No, I hope those days are over for you. By the way, I think there will be a Labor Day special on my history of Labor Day. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I have, and I always enjoy visiting with you and talking a little bit about history. So anyway, thank you, and we will see you in 2 weeks, Rochelle, correct? Okay. Bye-bye.
Aye.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.